So when he says, I'm leaving this galaxy for one less complicated, he actually goes into DC universe, which is... Hey guys, welcome to another graphic novel review. Today we'll be talking about Doomsday Clock. So, Doomsday Clock, the most official sequel to Watchman. As you know, there have been numerous sequels or, prequels, sequels as well with the TV show and stuff. But this one, if there is an official sequel, this is it. This is published by DC and it's written by one of the most prominent writers of the current generation of comic writers, Geoff Jones, and illustrated by amazing Gary Frank. So I read this book, I actually read these copies themselves in the graphic novel format. I do not read comics weekly or monthly. I do not read single issues or digital comics. I read them when they publish them as graphic novels. And I think this was not the right book for me to do that particularly, because within the 12 issues of this book there is a lot of world building, character work that needs to be digested issue by issue so that you absorb the story better and you can place your mind within the framework of the world the book presents you. I read the first 6 issues of the first volume in one sitting, and I read the remaining 6 issues in one sitting as well. There were a few months between the books, so there was that, but yeah, I don't suggest that schedule. So if you want to read it, make sure you have all 12 issues and maybe give it a week between them. I know this book had many delays. Some of you probably had to experience it that way with delays, and some of you probably gave up. That's actually why I read stories after they become graphic novels, because I want to make sure that they have an end and I don't want to be, left hanging. So if you know Gary Frank's art, especially Gary Frank and Brad Anderson's collaboration, Brad Anderson is the colorist, you know what to expect from this book. Nowadays, most of the artwork you see on comics is very much digitally enhanced in every way you can imagine. And I'm not saying these aren't, but Gary Frank has a quality in his illustrations that, as you can see, preserves that hand-drawn quality. Probably because he uses so many lines and his classical-looking character designs. That style gives the art more of a lived-in feeling, and that automatically makes you take the book itself more seriously. It looks like great cinematography. And it's also very reminiscent of the original Watchman if you look at the panel designs. There are a lot of 3x3 pages. The book is beautiful to look at. And of course, his Superman looks exactly like Christopher Reeve, so you know to take the Superman seriously as well. You feel like it is the Superman you're reading about, not a Superman. I love the book, but I do have a few problems with it. Actually, my main gripe with it, to be honest, is not even with the book itself, but how the story was incorporated into DC's rebirth phase. I know this book was supposed to come out after a stage in the publishing schedule of DC Comics, And with the changes brought with this book, DC was supposed to move on to their next phase of storytelling, like the next Rebirth or New 52, or they were talking about 5G at some point. And of course, there were a lot of Easter eggs and story connections in a number of Rebirth titles relating to this book. But because Geoff Johns was trying to do so many things at once, he was like CEO or Chief Creative Officer of DC Comics. He was the head of DC Entertainment. He was in charge of the movies, the DCEU movies. And later he was the showrunner of Stargirl, the DC Universe show. So basically he had too many things on his plate, which resulted in this book being plagued in delays. So it wasn't finalized when it was supposed to. And the rest of the DC publications moved on. So let's talk about the finished product itself. As it says on the covers, it's basically Watchmen meets the DC universe. It begins in the current, or then current, continuity of the DC universe, which was the Rebirth. But when you read the entire story and you look at the book objectively after you finish it, it's basically just a standalone. It's not part of the universe at all. And I think, I don't know who said it, someone from DC, maybe Tom, I don't know who said it, but someone said it's our job, now that it's finished, it's our job to incorporate the ramifications from the Doomsday Clock into the DC universe. I don't think they'll ever do that. Anyway, that's a side complaint. Let's look at the book itself. It does stand on its own. It has a cast of characters that I could not possibly list because it's basically the entire DC universe. It's impossible for me to talk about the storyline without spoiling it, so be on the lookout for the spoiler alert. The story begins the world of Watchman, actually. There's a different Rorschach here. There are two new characters introduced into the lore, Mime and Marionette. And Rorschach helps these two characters escape from the prison or asylum, wherever they were. And he does this because Ozymandias has a plan to save their world, and they need to basically cross over to a parallel world, which Ozymandias thinks that Dr. Manhattan has fled to after the events of Watchmen. So when he says, I'm leaving this galaxy for one less complicated, he actually goes into DC universe, which is okay. So the pacing is incredibly slow. I think what they tried to do is, in order to be a proper sequel to Watchmen, they wanted this story to have 12 issues. And because the art is so great and the writing, the not actual story, but the writing, the sentences are so beautiful, you don't get bored while you're reading it. But for 12 of those issues, I'm not singling out a specific issue like nothing happens on this one or that one. No, something small happens in every one of them, but most of the story in a significant number of issues is just filler. Not filler in the sense that it has nothing to do with the story. It has a lot to do with the story itself, those filler issues, those filler storylines. But you didn't need to include those stuff for the impact you want to reach at the end of this book. So I think if this was a 7 or 8 issue arc, it would have been much tighter and a much better, much more narratively fluent story. In that regard, if I were to separate the books, the first few issues can be appropriately described as boring, and the last 6 issues is when the real stuff starts to happen. But it's beautiful. Anyway, so after the events of Watchman, Dr. Manhattan moves to DC Universe, and, well, he's Dr. Manhattan. He's a godlike, all-knowing being. He knows how every simple detail of the universe, of any universe, works. But here in the DC Universe, there's something he doesn't quite make sense of, and that is Superman. He doesn't understand how absolute power, essentially his equal in this world, can also be absolute good, and how that reality shapes the universe around them. So he decides to adjust things. He decides to understand how Superman came to be. He changes Superman's origins. He does something else, but each and every time, even though the universe changes, which is described in the book as what caused the rebirth, New 52, Earth 2, and all the other Earths, all the DC multiverse, even though he changes the universe around Superman, Superman always persists and stays as a beacon of hope. So the book is meta in the sense that the original Watchman basically says if there were actually superheroes in the world, they would be, even if not entirely evil, hypocrites, which basically defended that the superheroes are fairy tales. If you were to look at superheroes in more than one dimension, you would have to do it like Alan Moore did in Watchmen. Now, this book argues that, okay, Watchmen is one of the greatest literary stories ever written, but it's very cynical about superheroes, and says that even though Watchman is Watchman, you couldn't have Watchman without Superman. So just like the Watchman is an antithesis to the superheroes in general, which can be summed up in Superman himself, this book is antithesis to Watchmen, and Dr. Manhattan, with all the Watchmen attitude behind him, crosses over to the DC world, sees Superman, and says, that can't be right. And the entire book gears up to a clash between these two ideologies. So the Dr. Manhattan represents the Watchmen universe, which is the cynical look at superheroes, and Superman represents the DC universe, which is the optimistic look to superheroes. So Dr. Manhattan cannot see the moment after he clashes with Superman, so he believes that either he is going to destroy Superman and will destroy everything else alongside him, or Superman will destroy him. And the entire book starts to build up to that climax after the first 6 issues. And that climax is incredible. That makes this entire thing worth it. But that doesn't inform if you like this book or not. Actually, it all boils down to how big of a Superman fan you are. Because the entire story, including that amazing climax, is about him and his character. So you will like this book if you are a fan of Superman. Because the end of the book is a love letter to Superman, and actually the entire classical superhero community, in which their optimism was inspired by Superman as a character. So if you are a seasoned Superman fan, this book will satisfy you like very few books ever did on Superman. If you're not, you will still respect this book because it's impossible not to. Now, is it a worthy follow-up to Watchmen? I say this. I think this is the only Watchmen follow-up story that you can officially regard as a sequel. It will never have the place Watchmen had in pop culture because, as I explained in the beginning, they tried to incorporate the book into the current continuity of the DC Universe, but it is a worthy follow-up. Yes, it has fat and fillers in parts, but dare I say, so did the original Watchmen. They didn't deter from the original story, but the original story would have a much better pace if they weren't there. So, is it better than Watchmen? Parts of it, especially the parts which deal with Superman. If you're a Superman fan, you'll like more than anything they did with Watchmen, but as the entire book, no, it's not better than Watchmen. But yes, if the main aim of this book was to unite the two worlds of DC and Watchmen, does it do that successfully? It does. So I'm not gonna say pick this up if this and that, no. I mean, if you are a Watchmen fan, if you are a DC fan, if you are a comic fan, or if you are a fan of comic books in general, you know you will read this. I'm just trying to adjust your expectations, so read it, but brace yourself for some long, slow filler storylines, but in the end, it's worth it. That was the review for Doomsday Clock. See you in the next one, guys.